Welcome back to Internet Librarian Connect Track B. I'm your host, Amy Affelt, and this session is called Singing Your Message in the Right Choir. And our speaker for this session is PC Sweeney from Every Library. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to express our appreciation for Every Library. In this unprecedented political climate that we have in the United States, every library is there every step of the way, fighting for democracy on the front lines of issues like book banning and other threats to libraries, learning, and education. And so I just want to thank PC so much for your work and Every Library, and please take it away.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Um, Welcome to the session. My name is Patrick Sweeney. I go professionally by PC Sweeney only because there's a million Patrick Sweeneys on the internet. If you have questions about anything or you want to connect with me later on, you can always find me as PC Sweeney on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the platforms. I also run the social media for Every Library. So if you contact Every Library through any of the social media platforms, I am there. I'll probably be the one to respond to it. Also, if you have questions from this session, you can email me at patrick.sweeney@everylibrary.org. And I'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions or thoughts or anything like that. I really want to thank you for having me for this session. I'm excited to be here. Let me tell you a little bit about this session. One of the things that I get asked about a lot is what message do we tell people in order to get them to support libraries? What message do we tell people to get them to vote for libraries, or take political action, or attend board meetings, or whatever we need them to do to support libraries? And the big problem with that question is that it varies significantly from community to community, is that we have very little data about the most effective messaging. And also the biggest issue, I think, is that messaging is one of the last things that we need to talk about when we're doing advocacy, when we're building political support or building political power and influence for a pro-library agenda. Messaging is one of the last things that we need to put together. There's a bunch of infrastructure that we need to put together first. I'm going to briefly go over some of that kind of thing. I'm also not going to be able to tell you what message you should use in your community, but I am going to be able to tell you what kind of messaging structures that you can use and how to put messaging out and what you need to look for and what you need to put together in order to have the right message at the right time in front of the right audience and the right medium. And we'll go through a lot of that kind of stuff. This is a short presentation. Typically, when we go through these kinds of things with an organization, as Every Library, all of the work that we do, if your library is facing political threats, if your library is facing funding threats, book banning issues, we have tons of resources. We have tools like Fight for the First, which is essentially a change.org platform for book banning. And we also have fundraising platforms, a bunch of other things that we can offer you. Direct funding, indirect funding, it's all done for you pro bono. So if you are facing any issue in your community around the politics of funding your library or around needing political support for your library, we are here to support you with consulting, training, funding, tools, digital tools, and other resources to help you fight back, or to help engage your community to get your community to fight back. Again, it's all done pro bono. Every Library's been around since about 2012. We've worked primarily in the beginning with libraries who are going to the voters. We've done about 150 library ballot initiatives that have helped bring in about $2.7 billion to libraries. We have also worked on dozens of library legislative issues. Book banning now is taking over kind of our life at the moment. If you need any help, please reach out to us. We're here to help. It's all pro bono. We're here to support you. The big reason that we created Every Library is because library funding, 90% of it comes from local library taxes. And those decisions are made by voters. Those decisions are made by local legislators, city councils, municipalities. We're talking about school libraries, school boards, and that kind of thing. And so we are here to help you work on the biggest part of library funding. Also, about 3 to 5% of library funding comes from the state. 3 to 5% library funding on average across the country comes from the federal government. And that means that 98% of library funding comes directly from politics, from political action. And that's something that I think we really need to be aware of. And that's something that's not discussed enough and hasn't been discussed enough in this industry. In fact, before Every Library existed, there was a study that found that only about 4 articles were written per year in all of the library industry about funding libraries through taxation, through legislation, fighting for building political support for libraries. Only 4 articles a year when it's 98% of library funding, which I think personally, I think is very terrifying and part of why we created Every Library. We need voter support if we want libraries to stay open, plain and simply. Like, 98% library funding is political in nature, whether it's legislators. We need voters to vote for legislators who care about libraries. We need voters to vote for libraries. I do want to make clear that libraries are neutral, or libraries are not neutral. Libraries stand for things. We stand for the First Amendment. We stand for access to information. We stand for things like the Library Bill of Rights. We do have professional values that we are constantly fighting for, so we can't be neutral. But usually what I find when people say that libraries should be neutral is that they're saying libraries shouldn't be political. Unfortunately, 98% library funding is political in nature. We have to be political. Also, we've been drawn into the culture war, so the activities that we're working on are actually political, right? Whether we want to be or not. But typically when I hear people say that libraries should be neutral, what they're actually trying to say is that libraries should be nonpartisan, and that is absolutely true. We see public support for libraries. There's not a big disparity between people on the left of politics and people on the right of politics. There's not a big disparity in their support for libraries across the country. Political support, whether that's voting, whether that's legislation. We do hear a lot more from the fringes of both the left and the right, people yelling about taxes or government or whatever, the role of taxes in government, and libraries are tax-funded government organizations. And so, I do want to make clear that we are not a partisan organization. Libraries aren't nonpartisan. I also want to talk about, political activists have 3 resources in order to do this kind of work. We have time, we have money, we have people. If we are working in politics, if we are building voter support, if we are doing the kind of messaging that we need to be doing, we need to be understanding that the messaging that we're doing needs to be building political power and influence, and that comes from time, money, and people. We're going to talk about how to use those as we go through this session. Now, when we talk about what activates, what influences politics, it is, let me just move my thing here. It is people and money. And people and money are the only things really that influence politics. Whether we're doing political work in the United States or whether we're doing political work in other countries, people and money drives politics. And so we need to be very aware about that when we're doing our messaging and we're understanding how to communicate to the public. We are working to build political power and influence for our communities. And that means that we have to be utilizing people and money, building people and money. One example of this is like the NRA. The NRA is an organization that does a very good job building political power and influence through people. The reason we can't have a conversation about the Second Amendment in this country is because at any given time, the NRA can immediately email 1 million voters in the legislator's district, and that incentivizes that legislator to take action that are beneficial to the NRA's agenda, right? That is political power. When we look at organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, they take money from corporate lobbyists, and they are driven by money. They're largely driven by money because a lot of the policies that they have, the majority of Americans wouldn't be in favor of. They are policies that benefit corporations and big business over people, and that's kind of why they use money. But they are able to raise and expend money through their network of funders that allows them to contribute or withhold funding to candidates' campaigns, to causes that support candidates, to a number of other things that support legislators. So legislators want to have, of course, that funding in order to stay in their positions. And that is why ALEC is primarily run by funding, right? Or they do their political influence and power building through money. They're able to incentivize legislators through withholding or contributing funding. What do libraries have, of course? I think the scariest thing that I've learned doing this work is that we don't have time. We're running out of time. Less people support libraries now than they ever did before. And that number continues to erode, especially as you run into the culture wars. We don't have money. We don't have the, NRA or ALEC or Koch brothers or that level of funding in order to fight some of the political issues that are facing us right now. And we don't have people. When I say we don't have people, what I mean is that we don't have a national database of library supporters. The ALA has, around 40,000 people that they can email at any given time across the country, and they're primarily librarians. Every library has, about 500,000 people that we can email at any given time or message at any given time when issues arise around libraries. But that's still not enough. We need millions of people who are identified library supporters. And we'll talk more about that as well. But this is the thing that scares me the most when we're facing so many issues, so many people coming after libraries, attacking libraries, the culture wars. We're being attacked as government-funded, tax-funded government organizations. We don't have the resources in order to fight back. And so a lot of the work that we're doing around our messaging needs to be, how do we raise money? How do we identify supporters? Luckily, I think what we can get is that the majority of Americans are still on our side. So the messaging that we're doing needs to be around, how do we identify supporters? How do we build support among the public? How do we identify supporters and cultivate and drive them into action? And we don't need a huge amount of people on our side because what we found, actually not what we found, but a researcher from Harvard named Erica Chenoweth found that actions engaging a threshold of just 3.5% of the population have never failed to bring about change. We don't need 20 million Americans, 30, 40, 50, 100 million Americans. We don't need the majority of Americans on our side. We need to identify 3.5% of the population, cultivate and empower them into action so that they are willing to vote for us, fight for us, vote for legislators who care about libraries, all of those kinds of things, in order to put political pressure on political systems to better fund libraries. And so 3.5% of the American population, we're looking at 9 million Americans, 10 million Americans, which really isn't a lot. We should be able to find them pretty easily. You should be able to find 3.5% of the population in your community who cares about your library, be able to identify them, cultivate them through your messaging, and empower them to take action on your behalf. And if you see my sessions before, I often talk about this data. I think the data around the work that we're doing is one of the only things that we should be talking about in librarianship, because I think it's very, very terrifying. Number one, the only time that we've ever measured political support in a comprehensive way in this industry is a report called Awareness to Funding. They ran it once in 2008, once in 2018. That's the data where all of this, these next couple of slides come from. If you haven't read them, I highly recommend them. That it's very eye-opening. I think it's very terrifying. When we look back at 2008, what we saw is 37% of Americans would definitely vote yes for the library. They just see the word library on the ballot, they vote in favor of it. 37% need to be convinced in some way, and 26% are unlikely or definitely going to vote against the library. That's almost entirely based, especially in 2008, it was almost entirely based on, people's belief around the role of taxes in government. They liked libraries, they just felt somebody else would pay for it, essentially. But watch what happens in 2018. We lost 10% of our definitely vote yes group. We lost 6% of our likely to vote yes group, and we're up to 42% who are likely to vote against libraries. This is terrifying. This is devastating, especially considering this data is 6 years old, especially considering that 98% of library funding is dependent upon voters' willingness to vote for us. If voters aren't willing to vote for us, legislators aren't willing to vote for us, there goes 98% of library funding. This should have been an eye-opening report in 2018. I hardly ever see it mentioned, and that's very terrifying to me. That's why I bring this up every time I do my sessions. When we look at the data in more depth, what we see is that, the super supporters, the people who support us the most, they drop slightly as a percentage of the population, but they're 16% less likely to vote for us. And that is wild to me. They love libraries, they're super supporters, but they're only 64% of them would vote for us in 2018. They use libraries as much as they did before. They rate libraries more positively than they did before. They rate librarians more positively than they did before, but they're less likely to vote for us. This is what we need to fix with our messaging. When we talk about messaging to the right chord, when we talk about how do we do messaging, how do we change our messaging, this is what we need to think about when we're messaging. How do we rebuild this public support on a national scale? You can do it locally, and I think it's incredibly important to do it locally, and we'll talk about how to do that in just a moment. When OCLC also did a study that looked at what libraries were trying to achieve with their current messaging. They wanted to increase community awareness of the library. They wanted to increase library use. They want to increase participation. They want to increase, people's attendance in person. However, these kinds of things are wrong things to be messaging. What is very interesting is that there's no correlation between library use and library support. Again, that's from that awareness to funding study. If somebody uses a library, they are not more likely to vote for it. If somebody doesn't use a library, they're not less likely to vote for it. There's no difference between a library user and a library non-user and their support for libraries. The only time we've seen a change in that, we've done a bunch of local public opinion polling to look at this data more closely for a lot of our local campaigns elections. We've found it's held true. So, the only time that we've seen a difference is when we see that somebody uses a library more than once every 2 weeks. If somebody uses a library more than once every 2 weeks, they're only 2% more likely to vote for libraries. So the messaging that we're doing is all about increasing library use, increasing library participation, increasing awareness of the library. You are not going to be able to effectively message the community to get what you need to keep your doors open. And we need to really be thinking about that and changing the way we're messaging to do messaging around building public support. And just so you know, I'm not making this up. This is again from the awareness to funding study. They had this call out of things that we should be doing. One of them was cultivate and empower our super supporters. That's 7.5, now 6.5% of the population. Remember, we only need 3.5% of the population to win. We know there's 6.5% out there that we can find. And they said cultivate and empower our super supporters. I put the word identify, and I put the word identify because we have no idea in this industry who supports libraries. We have no idea if library supporters are older, younger, wealthier, if they have children, if they're single parents, if they own homes, if they rent, if they drive a blue Subaru, or if they read Forbes magazine. I have no idea what a library supporter looks like. We've never done that kind of data, which is very common data to do among any industry that exists out there that is publicly supported the way we are. These kinds of data sets are run continuously, they're run constantly. We've only run them twice in the hundreds of years of libraries' existence. This is terrifying to me, that we don't know who these people are. So we have to identify them. One of the things that I thought was very scary was that I went to a political conference. We go to political conferences on the far left, on the far right. Conferences that are made up of political consultants, political operatives, people working in big level politics. And I was talking to a guy who runs like national politics. He runs like presidential level politics. And I said, oh, we do this thing for libraries. This is what we do. And he said, oh man, that's really interesting because it must be super difficult to do that work. And I was like, oh, why is that? And he goes, well, because everybody loves libraries, but nobody cares. And I had never heard it put that way, but that is exactly the problem that we're running into. Everybody loves libraries. Even the people who are voting against libraries often say that they love libraries. The problem is that we haven't built a messaging around getting people to care about libraries. We've gotten messaging to get people to love libraries, but not messaging around getting people to care about libraries. I also think what's interesting right now is with the culture wars that are happening around libraries, that we have an opportunity in the national discussion around libraries. We've never had a national discussion around libraries to the significant level that we have right now. We have a huge opportunity to do messaging around getting people to care about libraries. I'm actually going to skip this real quick. No, I'm going to do this one. One of the biggest problems with advocacy that I've seen is that almost all of the advocacy that I've heard is, if we tell people good things about libraries, some miracle will occur and then libraries will be funded. I've heard it from every state association, national association, all the trainings I've gone to, the books that are written in this industry, is if we just get people to use us, if we just tell them good stories about libraries, some kind of miracle will occur and people will then vote for libraries. And that's just not how politics works. That's not how political messaging works. It takes a lot more nuance. It takes a lot more work than just telling good stories, saying good things about libraries. Our strategy and our messaging should not be how do we get users. There's no correlation between library use and library support. What is interesting, though, is that if you are messaging around building library support, around cultivating people into caring about libraries, is that people who have a propensity or a need to use libraries will become library users. You will still get more library users if you message about why libraries are important. People who have a propensity and need to use the library will become library users. You will still increase library use. But if your messaging is just around how do we get people to use libraries, you aren't going to cultivate the support that you need. You're just not. And so we need to change our strategy from trying to cultivate library users and raising awareness about libraries, because look, everybody knows libraries exist. There's nobody out there who really doesn't know that libraries exist. They know your library exists. They might not go to it. They might not know everything that it does, but they are aware that your library exists. Our strategy needs to be, how do we build library supporters when we're doing all of our messaging? One of the things that I want to make sure that we don't conflate here is the difference between tactics and strategy. A strategy is, we are working to build library support. A tactic is, how do we do that? I've worked with a bunch of libraries on political action where they said, oh, we've got a great strategy. We're on Facebook. Oh, we've got a great strategy. We're on Twitter. We've got a great strategy. We're sending out direct mail. None of those are strategies. All of those are tactics to get your message out. Don't conflate the two. Just being on Facebook, just being on Twitter, just being in those spaces, just putting up a billboard or bar coasters, none of those things are a strategy. They're all a tactic. Okay. I also want to talk about what kind of supporters there are so we know how to message to different kinds of supporters. We have relational supporters. We have ideological supporters, we have aversion supporters, we have access supporters, 4 kinds of supporters. Relational supporters are the people that you know, they're your friends, your neighbors, your family. Ideological supporters are people who you don't know, but who care about your issue. Aversion supporters are people who care about your issue because they dislike the other side more. So somebody votes for Trump because they hate Hillary, they vote for Hillary because they hate Trump. Those are aversion supporters. They don't necessarily care for whichever candidate they're voting for. They just dislike the other candidate more. There's also access supporters, but libraries don't really have access supporters. Access supporters are people who, they make a donation to Obama's campaign because they want access to Obama, right? They make a $1,000 contribution because they know that they will get more pull with Obama. Access supporters are lobbyists and those kinds of things. They make contributions to candidate campaigns in order to get access to those candidates. When we are working on building support for libraries, this is what the ladder of engagement looks like to move people up to become library supporters. People who are unaware, we want to make them aware of of libraries. People are aware of libraries. Luckily, most people are at the observer level or at the aware level. We want them to become observers. People who become observers are people who are following you on Twitter, following you on Facebook. You have their email address. They're on your email list. They're people who are contactable in some way. People who hear from you in some way are observers. People who become supporters are people who've been messaged to around the things that they care about. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And advocates are people who take action on your behalf. They're the people who show up at board meetings, sign petitions, make donations, those kinds of things. So I want you to understand that as we go through this. If you take anything away from this session, it's that your email list is one of the most powerful tools you have for messaging. And there's a famous quote, from Archimedes, give me a large enough email list and a platform to send them from, and I shall move the world. Of course, the actual quote is, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum to set it on, and I shall move the world. I mean, that is an email list. We have seen huge movements launched just through email lists. In fact, most of the fight that's coming to us from around the book banning, people calling us groomers, people calling us pedophiles, is largely coming from email lists. We see it on social media, but if you're on, and I'm on all these different email lists, so I see the emails that are coming in that are calling librarians groomers, that are calling librarians pedophiles. They're really cultivating, and utilizing messaging really significantly through huge email lists where they're able to contact millions of Americans. What we need as an industry is to build a national library supporter list. Every library is working on it. Again, we have like 400,000. We need like 5 to 10 million. But locally, you need to be building your own. So a lot of your messaging needs to be, how do we move these people to get them in a space where we can message to them, where they want to hear from us? Your email list is one of the most significant places you can do that. Let's talk about messaging. One of the big things that I've seen is that, if a library that loses, oftentimes it's because they're not messaging. They're not paying to put their message in front of people. They don't have a marketing budget. It is really tough to do messaging when you don't have a way to make people hear it. And if you don't have a way to make people hear it, people will make up their own messages. I can't tell you how many times I've heard campaigns or seen campaigns go sideways simply because the library didn't put out enough messaging of its own. The public created their own messages, and went after the library with a bunch of nonsense and lies that couldn't be corrected, simply because the library didn't have the resources to put messages out into the community, didn't have opportunity to put the correct numbers. I've seen library campaigns lose because somebody in the community put up a Facebook post that's like, the new library is going to cost $150 million. Are we really on the line? But the new library, it was going to cost $1.5 million. And there's no way to get around that once that kind of messaging gets out. So don't let that vacuum get filled. Fill it yourself with the messages that you want out in the public. You can do that with a process called surfacing. Surfacing is the messaging infrastructure that you want to build before you have to ask the public for something. A good example of this is we see this happen in libraries because a book comes out about 2 years before somebody runs for office. That book is the opportunity for the candidate to put themselves in front of the public and tell their story without opposition, because they're not running for anything yet. Nobody's opposing them yet. It's very easy to be persuadable and do persuasion messaging work when you aren't asking for anything. The second you start asking for something, people start questioning your message. It's hard to lay the groundwork for messaging once a campaign starts, once the public becomes aware of a campaign, once the public becomes aware of an ask. So if you have an open field right now, if you aren't going to the voters 5 years from now, 10 years from now, start today. Start with this messaging process today, because it'll be too late later on. We should have been doing messaging to counter a lot of this book banning stuff years and years ago, but we didn't. When we're talking about messaging, there is also this idea of an Overton window, right? An Overton window is you put messaging out that's exceptionally extreme so that you can scale back what you're asking for in order to get what it is that you really want. So, You know, the defund the police movement wasn't actually about defunding the police. It was about holding holding police accountable. They wanted policies to hold police accountable, and they wanted things like body cams and those kinds of things. But they started talking about defunding the police because that made policies and body cams sound more reasonable, right? And what we're seeing right now, when people are coming after libraries and calling libraries pedophiles and groomers and all those kinds of things, you know, we're seeing them trying to move the Overton window so that something that we would have thought was unreasonable before will become reasonable now. The way that messaging works is that messaging is filtered through the issues that the person that you're speaking to already cares about. What I've seen with a lot of library messaging is that they are attempting to tell people about the library using a message that the public doesn't care about. So, you know, if somebody in the public cares about the economy and you're messaging to them about how the library is influential in education, they're just not going to care. They're not going to believe that the library does anything for them. If you know that somebody cares about the economy, talk about the library's impact on the local economy. If they care about public safety, talk about how the library is part of a holistic approach to making the community safer. If they care about education, talk about the things that the library does to benefit education. We don't have the resources to talk to people all the time about all the things through all the mediums. And so we need to be able to understand our community well enough that we know that we can put these messages in front of these people, these messages in front of those people. This is really easy with social media. I'm not going to go into all of that, but targeting on social media is super easy. You can just type in, here's an ad group, people who care about education. Here's issues or here's messages around education that I'm targeting people who already care about messaging, who already care about education. Here's people who care about the economy. I'm going to put messages in front of them about how the library impacts the economy. Targeting right now is super easy. As part of what makes social media super influential and weaponized in politics because they're putting messages through the issues that people already care about. The other thing to remember is, you know, having a sense of urgency. Why are you putting this message in front of this person right now? If you don't have urgency around your messaging, people aren't going to care. If it's something that they can put off till later, they're going to put it off till later. They're going to forget. They're not going to take any kind of action. Why this message? Why right now? And what actions do they need to take? How to solve this problem right now? If there's just like, you know, there's just a general problem that exists in the community, like, you know, a percentage of the population is illiterate, supports your library. Well, why am I getting that message right now? Like that's something I can take care of later on. You know, it's not a problem now. I can take care of this problem later on, right? But if you're saying, you know, we have an opportunity to turn this around right now by bringing your children to story time, you know, that's a stronger message. When story times are, here's a deadline, here's a date. You know, sign this petition right now, take this action right now. This legislation is existing right now. That creates that sense of urgency to get people to actually take actions now instead of putting it off until later. This is a numbers game. The more people see your message, the more often more people see your message, you know, the more likely they are to believe it. And I think we've seen that a lot with a lot of the political discourse right now. So many people are hearing things over and over and over again to such an extent that they believe them, even things that are preposterous, even things that we know factually are untrue, with just the egregious amount of misinformation and disinformation that is existing out there. If you tell somebody something over and over and over and over again, they will believe it, even if it's nonsense, you know, and that's what we're seeing right now. And so what you need to do is you need to fill that vacuum of messaging space with your messages, which are factual, which are truthful, so that they don't fill the vacuum with nonsense, right? One example of this is that somebody was saying that, you know, libraries only do story times with gay people and drag queens. Why don't they ever do story times with public safety officers or the police? Libraries do tons of like sheriff story times, police officer story times. They do it all the time. But libraries never promoted that fact. So it was very easy to create a narrative that libraries are only doing drag queen story times. That's the only story time that they're doing, right? Which is, of course, nonsense. But I still hear that over and over and over again because they said it so many times that people believed it. Messaging is only a part of the puzzle. People are also influenced by their social identities, by their social circles, by their political identification, by so many other things, right? And that's something that we need to be aware of. When we're talking about things like opinion leaders, that's influencer marketing. That's getting the message out through influencers. Through political identification, that's getting Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Tea Party members to talk positively about libraries. We're talking about social circles, that we're talking about getting involved in those social circles, in civic centers, in those spaces. We're talking about social identities, reaching people where they are. Libraries don't do a lot of work messaging through churches, but a lot of community organizing happens through churches, right? Libraries don't do a lot of messaging to upper class, wealthier individuals. And I think we need to, because that's where a lot of the money comes from to do work and to get the money that we need to do our political work. One of the most important things about how we get messages out is how do we build audiences and making sure that we are addressing audiences. Right now, libraries have like 5 audiences that we speak to. There's children's, teens, adults, seniors, and parents. And that's almost what every library talks to. But people are so much more nuanced than that. When we look at national campaigns, like Trump's campaign in 2016 had 1,200 separate and distinct audience segments that they messaged to. Each of those segments got different messages based on the issues that they cared about, based on the medium through which they received those messages. So through direct mail, through social media, through traditional media, through earned media, through paid media, over-the-top advertising. Like, they knew where their audiences were, which audiences were in those spaces, and what message to put in front of those audiences in order to engage them. We have never done that kind of work at a national level in libraries. We desperately need to locally. You can run public opinion polling to help build different audiences and understand different audiences. You can target people really easily on social media. You should be doing high-level targeting with the smallest possible audiences receiving your messages, not the biggest possible audience receiving your message, because you're going to have a lot of overlap. If you spend just 1 penny putting the wrong message in front of the wrong person at the wrong time through the wrong medium, you've messed up. You've wasted that penny. And so smaller audiences are more effective than larger audiences. Break down your community into the smallest possible audiences and message specific to those audiences. And you can do that through social media ad targeting. You can also get ad messages through a bunch of different places, A to C databases, Reference USA. So many libraries have access to this tool and they don't use it. If you have it, jump into it, play with it, learn it. You can create lists of people who just moved into your community. You can create lists of people who care about reading. You can create lists of people who read mystery books in A to Z databases. I think it's called something else now, but I'm totally blanking on what it's called now. Of course, Facebook and social media, social hacking. There's also vendor tools like Orange Boy or Analytics on Demand. I highly recommend using those to build those audiences. So let's talk about the stories, not stats. Stories influence politics, stories that are emotional. This is a very dated slide at this point. But back in the 2012 election, we had Joe the plumber, and his story was about the national deficit and the national debt and how that was going to impact him as a plumber. I don't know anybody who can name the national debt in 2012, but everybody knows the story of Joe the plumber. If you're around then, this is a dated slide now, but if you're around then, you know who Joe the plumber was, and you know his story, right? And stories are impactful. They reach more people. They reach more people emotionally. Telling those stories of impact in your community is extremely beneficial. You have 4 kinds of different stories that you can tell. Stories of your successes are of course important. Stories about your failures are also important. if you tell them in the right way. You know, you're not putting a story out there like libraries are collapsing or whatever, our library can't do its job, but saying things like, you know, we don't have enough room for story time. You know, these are the things that new money, these are the things that more political support will bring to our community, stories of our failures, and presenting a solution is what helps give people an idea of how they can be a part of that solution and help get more into their community. And of course, you want to tell stories about people that the audience cares about. Not everybody in the world cares about everybody in the world. Unfortunately, you know, there is a strong contingent of people who right now are very against LGBTQ people. And if you tell the story that you support LGBTQ people to those individuals, you will actually lose support for your library, which I think is wild right now. And then, of course, stories that decision makers want to hear. Telling a decision maker a story about the economy when they care about education isn't going to do you any good. You got to tell decision makers who care about education, you got to tell them stories about education. So telling your story, you identify an audience, you segment that audience, you figure out what it is that they care about, and then you tell them the story that they would care about. And that's the way to think through that storytelling. Telling everybody all the good things about libraries all the time is just not an effective messaging strategy. It just won't work, and you'll spend significant amounts of money, losing significant amount of money, and not building the support that we need. I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna skip a little bit because we only have a few minutes left. But when we're talking about writing for politics, it's different, right? Librarians are largely academic. We have a lot of insider language. We like to cite our sources. None of that matters when we're writing for politics. The structure that we can use when we're writing for politics is called problem, agitation, solution. You state a problem, you agitate it, and then you give them a solution in order to alleviate the level of anxiety that you created with your agitation. This is just engaging with people's fight or flight responses. So if you're on anybody's email list, they will come at you with a problem, agitation, solution model of messaging. So state a problem, you know, children in our community are growing up to be illiterate. The agitation is how will that impact the reader? So if children grow up to be less literate, you will be burdened with higher taxes. You will be burdened with higher crime rates. You know, how does it impact the person who's reading that? You know, that's what you really want to make sure that you're doing with that agitation. And the solution is, what do they need to do to solve that problem? Bring your children to story time, support your local library, you know, whatever it is that you want to put out there. That is how you get people to take an action, whether it's getting people to donate, whether it's getting people to show up at a board meeting, sign a petition. This problem agitation solution model is incredibly important. There's a bunch more that you can read about it. Obviously, just Googling PAS or problem agitation solution. When we're writing stuff and we're putting stuff on the internet, I see libraries put out huge blocks of text all the time. This is really unlikely to get read. There's tons of data around this that say that this just doesn't get read, but this does. It's the same number of words. It's the same exact words. This is more likely to get read when you break up in white space like this. We're writing at a fourth grade level when we're writing for politics, and what that means, that doesn't mean that the American public is so stupid that they only understand a fourth grade level. That just means that they're so inundated with information that for them to get through what you're reading, if you write at a fourth grade level, they're more likely to comprehend it, internalize it quickly, so that they know what you're saying to them. We also need to understand the languages that we're talking. There's a progressive language, there's a conservative language, there's libertarian language. I'm not going to dive into it. Mostly, I also don't have time, but there's a great book called The Three Languages of Politics by Arno Kling. I highly recommend this book. There's also these two books. Words That Work is written by a right-wing messaging person, and then there's George Lakoff, who's from the progressive side. Reading these books tell you how to get right messages that are more effective.
I'm sorry I
Like,
have to interrupt because
yeah,
we're at
cool.
time here, but
Oh,
are you
sure.
going to be able to meet people in the networking area for about 15 minutes to answer any other questions that people have?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah.
Sure. Sure.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and this is really, really informative and helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.